One day in October 2018, a journalist, Jamal Khashoggi, went into the Saudi Arabian consulate in Istanbul. He would never come out.
There were 15 of them. Most arrived in the dead of night, laid their trap, and waited for the target to arrive. That target was Jamal Khashoggi.
Although Saudi Arabia rigorously denied it, it soon became evident that Khashoggi had been killed in an assassination, most likely sanctioned by the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman.
This 33-year-old is the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. He's one of the most powerful men in the Middle East. But is he a progressive reformer bringing a deeply conservative kingdom into the 21st century, or a brutal hardliner silencing dissenters?
Less than 2 years later, Mohammed bin Salman is back in the news.
The principles of who's buying it, you'll have people out of left field saying the track record of people in Saudi Arabia and the ownership criteria is something they find unpalatable. If the money's legitimate, then there's no reason why people can't acquire football clubs. Whether you like Middle Eastern influence and ownership in football clubs is another matter.
Heading up a consortium to buy Newcastle United off Mike Ashley, the man, known more colloquially as MBS, finds himself following in the footsteps of his mentor, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, the owner of Manchester City. In this episode, we ask, who is Mohammed bin Salman, and why is he buying Newcastle United?
It wasn't a surprise, I don't think. I think the Saudi takeover had been mooted for some time, although it wasn't clear whether it was going to be Newcastle or Manchester.
Nicholas McGeehan is a human rights activist and researcher.
I think the overriding concern of someone who works in the region was that this would be disastrous for the game and really bad for the city of Newcastle. It's a deeply abusive regime, and it brings with it all sorts of problems and ramifications.
Talk us through the basics of the deal. How does it break down?
As I understand it, it's a deal between three parties. So there's Amanda Staveley, who's a UK financier based in Dubai, who helped broker the Manchester City deal. There's the Rubin brothers, who are British property developers and I think Britain's second richest family. But the main player is the Saudi Public Investment Fund, which is said to control or will control 80% of the club, which is essentially a sovereign investment arm of the Saudi Arabian state. I believe that it's subject to the Premier League's owner and directors test, but it seems as if it's quite well advanced at this stage.
How can international trade and investment transform economies? At PIF, we're driven by our mission to be one of the largest sovereign wealth funds in the world, to build strong economic partnerships, to deepen and strengthen the impact of the role of Saudi Arabia on the regional and global stages.
Tell us a little bit about the Public Investment Fund of Saudi Arabia.
So Saudi Arabia, like many oil-rich states, has a sovereign investment arm. I mean, Saudi Arabia has 16.5% of the world's oil and gas reserves, so it's tremendously wealthy. The PIF has about $2 trillion in assets, and these vehicles are a way for the state to invest its money around the world. What's interesting, I think, about PIF is that Saudi Arabia has been going through a lot of financial reforms of late, but actually it's going to be exempt from those financial reforms, so it's not subject to oversight. Its chairman is Mohammed bin Salman, and the concern about the PIF is that he'll be able to use it to keep direct control of public revenues as if it were actually his private fortune. So the difference between a Gulf private sovereign wealth fund and, for example, the Norwegian sovereign wealth fund is this complete lack of transparency and the way that they can be used to enrich those who control them.
So why might a Saudi Arabian investment fund be interested in buying a football team?
You have to go back, I think, a few years to a strategy called Vision 2030, which is a strategy whereby the Saudi Arabian state attempted to lessen its dependence on oil and gas. To do that, they need to attract a lot of foreign investment and they need to significantly improve their image. Now, Saudi Arabia has a very poor record on human rights and it has a very poor public relations record generally. It's associated frequently with repressive attitudes towards women, public beheadings and such. Now, if you want to change that reputation, sport's a great way of doing that. It's a great way of presenting an alternative narrative of the state. I think Saudi Arabia will have looked to other countries in the region. They'll have looked at the United Arab Emirates and how Abu Dhabi and Dubai have used sport very effectively in their public relations. And they've clearly identified it as one of the key ways to look more progressive, more liberal, more tolerant. They've also moved into sport of late. We had the Andy Ruiz and the Anthony Joshua fight in Saudi Arabia recently. I think the proposed takeover of Newcastle would fit very much into this mould. Some people call it sports washing. That's a fairly reductive term, but in this case, I think it's probably quite accurate.
And why do you think Newcastle in particular? What does the club offer that the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman might want?
Newcastle has a huge support. It has a lot of potential. It's known as something of a sleeping giant. I think the fact that it's an English club is significant, very significant. You know, the English Premier League has huge global appeal. It's seen around the world. It's a great way to advertise your brand, to promote your country. One other factor could be, I do think they'll be looking very closely at what Abu Dhabi did in Manchester. Newcastle is another city that suffered greatly under austerity. It's in need of regeneration. I would imagine if this deal goes through, it would be accompanied by some regeneration, some property deals, for example, which will allow the owners to garner public support, to push back against criticism of the deal. They'll want to be seen as benefactors. And Newcastle's a city, I think, where they might be able to do that quite effectively.
I want to talk a little bit about the man behind this, the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who you've mentioned already. I think the best place to start is probably with a potted history of Saudi Arabia. So could you give us some of the key points in the history of Saudi Arabia?
The modern state of Saudi Arabia was created in 1932, but actually its constitution in many respects is rooted in a meeting almost 200 years earlier between the leading member of the Al Saud tribe in Saudi and a fundamental Islamic scholar called Muhammad al-Wahhab. Now that created a marriage of convenience, which continues today. And the convenience is between a very wealthy family and a group of clerics who want to promote a fundamentalist version, an austere version of Islam. Now, the impact of this probably went global after 1938, when oil was discovered in Saudi Arabia. So Saudi Arabia is now almost singularly responsible for the spread of extremist Islamic ideology, which is most obvious, for example, in bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, and more recently, ISIS. Now, this is overseen and tolerated by the Al Saud family. And I guess the marriage of convenience relates to the fact that their tolerances, their excesses, it's an incredibly wealthy family, which draws heavily on the country's oil money to enrich itself. But those excesses are overlooked by the clerics. So it is a country which is phenomenally powerful, phenomenally influential. And the head of that family now is the young Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman.
I think what's so fascinating about the history of Saudi Arabia is that it is so small, just 3 generations. But also I think when you're talking about Mohammed bin Salman, what's so interesting about him is that it's just so unlikely that he would have ended up in such an important position of power. His father, Salman, was very far down the pecking order in terms of the chain of succession. And again, bin Salman himself was even further down the pecking order in his father's family. So how did he end up in this position of power, next in line to the throne, and as you've said, effectively running the country at the moment?
He's the 6th son of the 25th son of the first king, Abdulaziz. So yeah, it is by dint of fate and circumstance that he got there. His father, I think, was a governor of Riyadh, quite charismatic, an effective leader. And Mohammed is his 6th son from his second wife. You know, the circumstances by which he came to power largely relate to deaths and circumstance. Some of Salman's brothers died and he eventually was elevated to king, where he sits today. The manner in which Mohammed bin Salman came to power was largely because, unlike many of his counterparts in the Saudi family, he shunned, Geneva, he shunned London, he shunned New York. He wasn't interested in that playboy lifestyle. He was far more comfortable at home. He went to law school in Saudi Arabia. He was often found out in the desert hosting lavish banquets. He spent a lot of time networking and making contacts in and around his father's circle, and in many respects became the apple of his father's eye. He's very energetic. He's very charismatic. also something of a loose cannon. But essentially, it was the manner in which he curried favour with his father. His father saw him as a better protector of perhaps traditional Saudi values and traditions, which led to his elevation to Crown Prince. He was elevated to that position in 2017 after having been made Defence Minister in 2015. So it was a stratospheric rise to power, which nobody saw coming. But there he is, and he's now all-powerful.
The Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, is expected to have his first public appearance and first time we will hear from him at their Showcase Investment Conference today. This is the first time we are hearing from him.
Mohammed bin Salman's rise to power culminates in the so-called Davos in the Desert investment conference. Could you tell us a little bit about that event?
Yeah, so Davos was again, go back to Vision 2030 in this attempt to present Saudi Arabia as a place that's open for business, that's liberal and tolerant. So the world's business leaders were brought to this event in Saudi Arabia, and the keynote speaker was the new Crown Prince, was the new man who was going to be the great leader of this new reform agenda. He, by all accounts, was very impressive. He talked about the need for reform. He talked about how Saudi had a young population and needed to turn its back on backward ideology. And this was very warmly received at the time. And at the time, he was being feted in capitals around the world as the great solution to this long-standing problem within Saudi Arabia of, fundamentalist attitudes. So, yeah, I guess this was probably the high point of his short rule so far, but things quickly went sour.
And how convincing do you find this so-called drive for modernisation?
It's clear there's a drive for modernisation. It's clear there is a reform agenda. But bin Salman wants to achieve that by at the same time holding on to the country with an iron fist and actually increasing repression. So there will be a sort of social liberalisation. There'll be the moves to allow women to drive, things that look good in Western capitals, things that allow Saudi Arabia to present itself as modern and progressive. But at the same time, he's cracking down very hard on individual rights.
Inside the kingdom, MBS is also seeking to cement his authority and dominance over the royal family.
Saudi Arabia's young crown prince arresting hundreds of his own cousins and
crackdown on corruption. 11 princes and nearly 40 current or former officials detained, reportedly being held at the lavish Ritz-Carlton.
He's centralising power. He claims to be tackling corruption while clearly enriching himself and those around him. So there is a reform agenda, but it has to be put in inverted commas because it is not being accompanied by genuine social reform, by any advancement in individual liberties and freedoms, other than the ones which keep people in the West happy, i.e. pop concerts and women driving to them.
And there's also the well-documented case of the killing of the journalist Jamal Khashoggi.
The murder of Jamal Khashoggi in October 2018 was undoubtedly the incident, actually, that's put the biggest spoke in the wheels of this project, of the MBS project. He was lured to the consulate in Istanbul to pick up documents that would allow him to marry his fiancée. He was suffocated and dismembered by a 15-man assassination squad, which was been sent in, people presume, by Mohammed bin Salman. A Republican senator who was briefed by the CIA about it said if the Crown Prince went in front of a jury, he would be convicted in 30 minutes. The UN Special Rapporteur said it was a premeditated extrajudicial execution. So there's little doubt that this man, who used to be an advisor to the royal court, who was well respected, who was a journalist for the Washington Post, there's very little doubt that he was murdered and that he was murdered at the behest of Mohammed bin Salman.
How widespread is Saudi ownership in the Premier League already?
This is the first involvement of the state. There is the Sheffield United ownership, which is from Saudi businessmen, but not someone who is closely linked to the state. So it is different in that regard. So far, they actually haven't been as involved in football ownership as, for example, the United Arab Emirates or Qatar have. So this would be their first major entry into football ownership.
There's obviously been many tie-ins with various Saudi financial interests as well, and the Premier League has sort of allowed those to proceed without any critique, really. So Manchester United is a club that has links. West Ham have got links. You've mentioned Sheffield United, Chelsea as well. Has the Premier League already made up its mind as to the morality of allowing this sort of ownership in its league?
I don't know that the Premier League has made up its mind. I think this case will be very interesting for it. It's one thing to talk about sponsorships and commercial tie-ins with a state. That's one thing. It's another thing to allow a state to own and direct a football club. That puts things in a different sphere entirely, and it has to be seen through a different lens. I don't think it's necessarily possible to prevent sponsorship deals from human rights abusing states. We see that all over. It's distasteful. People can rightly campaign against it. I wouldn't like to see any of that stuff on a club that I supported. But when you're talking about a dictator, a kleptocrat, a man with blood on his hands, owning this and directing this very important social institution, I do think that's something that needs to be looked at with far more scrutiny.
He is one of the most powerful men on earth, and yet the ruler of the United Arab Emirates maintains a relatively low profile on the world stage. But with hostility between the U.S. and Iran threatening chaos across the Middle East, Mohammed bin Zayed could soon emerge as a key player in bringing down tensions in the region.
For fans of the Premier League, this approach to club ownership has already been seen in the case of Manchester City. How much of this is Mohammed bin Salman following the blueprint of his mentor Mohammed bin Zayed in Abu Dhabi?
The first person that MBS, as he's often known, would have consulted about this would have been MBZ, his counterpart in Abu Dhabi, who effectively controls Manchester City. Much of what Mohammed bin Salman has done since he's come to power has been done following the lead of Abu Dhabi. And actually, they've done many things together. For example, the war in Yemen, which began a few months after MBS came to power. That suited the United Arab Emirates. The attack on Qatar, that suited the United Arab Emirates. And the way in which Abu Dhabi has used football to advance its image, to burnish its commercial credentials, to generate and create political influence in the UK, and to do so very adeptly and very astutely and very professionally, I think that is very clearly the blueprint that MBS will be following. I also think that's one of the reasons the Premier League and the FA should be looking at this deal, because to have two dictators, essentially, who are very close allies, who are in cahoots, who conspire together, who fight wars together, to have these two men running rival football clubs raises all sorts of questions, I think, about the integrity of the game.
You've already touched on this issue, but I would be interested to press you further on the difference between states owning football clubs and the debates about football ownership. Why is it that states now owning football clubs is considered much worse than, for example, a businessman who has dubious ties owning a football club?
If you consider what a state can do, if you consider the types of abuses a state can commit. So Saudi Arabia is one of the most abusive states in the world. It's been involved in alleged war crimes in Yemen. It's created humanitarian catastrophes there. The man in charge can murder and dismember journalists and claim state immunity and get away with it. They can hold millions of migrant workers in conditions of virtual servitude. And at the same time, they can own a club and present an image that is liberal and progressive and tolerant and completely at odds with the actual reality. When people talk about sports washing, I think what they fail to do is they fail to say what sports washing is, or they misrepresent it. They say it's about cleansing the reputation of a state. It's not really. It's about presenting a very well-funded alternative narrative of the state that will shape perceptions and opinions and make it very difficult for human rights groups, for example, and journalists in the media to effectively criticise that state. So sponsorship is one thing, but it doesn't give you the control. It doesn't give you the platform that ownership does, as we've seen, for example, when you compare what Abu Dhabi have done with Manchester City versus, for example, what Emirates have done with Arsenal. Same state, same types of abuses, but clearly a very different model. When you compare states to businessmen, I mean, Ashley, for example, is deeply unpopular for very good reason, but he is not and never will be and never could be on the same level as someone like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia.
You've mentioned sports washing. Is there a tendency to use sports washing as a way to decry Middle Eastern states in particular in ways that doesn't happen with other states? For example, Russian oligarchs can use football clubs for themselves in similar activities. They give themselves higher profiles globally. They are able to launder money, much of which can be obtained through pretty insalubrious political activities. Is there a tendency to use sports washing as a front for maybe attacking Middle Eastern states in particular?
The sports washing term has definitely been rigorously applied to the Middle Eastern states, and you often see on fan forums, for example, accusations of anti-Arab racism in relation to this stuff. But the reality is that they're just the ones who do it most effectively and who throw most money at it right now. Yes, there are other parts of the world who do it, and they are criticised for it. I think there's been plenty of attention paid to Russia, for example, and the Olympics there and the World Cup. But yeah, it's just the fact that the Gulf states in particular are the ones who are most adept at it. So I think the criticism is justified. I find the term a little bit reductive. I don't think it fully captures what's going on. I don't think it fully captures the nuance. But I think it's absolutely, essentially it is fair criticism. And the fact that it's directed at the Gulf states is just a reflection of the reality of what's happening.
You've mentioned the fan response, and we've obviously seen a lot of toing and froing in the media, with a lot of the media calling out the Saudi regime and then fans obviously fighting back. Much of what happens in these scenarios is a race to equivocate morally. Obviously, we've already mentioned that Newcastle's outgoing owner, Mike Ashley, has been notorious, not just as an owner of a football club, but also of a company that treats its staff generally terribly. If PIF come in to rejuvenate the North East in various ways, even under the guise of sports washing, should the people of Newcastle not feel positive about the takeover in the immediate for themselves?
I think it's very understandable that football supporters see someone like MBS as being a saviour, because he'll make them successful again and he'll put money into deprived areas of their town and regenerate them potentially. So it's entirely understandable that people would look locally and look for the benefits locally. To lay the blame of this situation at the door of fans is misguided, and also just ignores the reality that fans are fanatic and in many cases zealots who just won't get past their club. It is important to look at the bigger picture here. It's important to look at just how grave, just how severe these abuses are. Look at how much blood is on the hands, and look at what does it mean for the city of Newcastle? What does it mean for the club of Newcastle to be associated with that? And that's, I think, where you'd be hoping for wiser heads to prevail and to put forward those arguments. I mean, there's a really interesting case, John, which I think is worth talking about, which sort of gets to a lot of what's happening here. So there's a women's rights activist called Lujain Al-Hathloul.
Lujain Al-Hathloul is a young activist who's been fighting for Saudi women's right to drive, among other demands, and was ranked by Arabian Business magazine as third on the list of top most powerful Arab women in 2015, in recognition of her fearless activism.
Now, Lujain was one of the women's rights activists in Saudi Arabia who was responsible for campaigning for allowing women to drive. Now, eventually, women were given the right to drive in September 2017, I think. And MBS was given a lot of the credit for that. And this was seen as a great part of the reform agenda. Now, Lujain left the country because she was worried she'd been harassed and intimidated, and she went for what she thought was the relative safety of Abu Dhabi. Now, in March 2018, she was driving to her classes at the Sorbonne, Abu Dhabi, and she was pulled over by the police, and she was arrested and rendered to Saudi Arabia. She's 29 years old. Eventually, when her family were able to meet her, they found that she'd been held in solitary confinement. She'd been beaten. She'd been waterboarded. She'd been given electric shocks. She'd been threatened with rape and murder. And her parents saw her thighs blackened with bruises. Now, she's somebody whose name and whose picture should be all over Newcastle if this deal goes through. She was rendered to the prospective owner of Newcastle United by the current owner and director of Manchester City. And I think her case in isolation just tells you everything that's wrong about allowing these people into English football. It's not about racism. It's about the most fundamental, basic values of human decency. That's leaving aside all the problems with strategy and finance. This is just the moral issue of why it's absolutely wrong and shouldn't be allowed to proceed. So I hope if it does go ahead, that she's there. And in all of these discussions about, well, can't we be happy about what's happening to our city? But I just hope people read about that case and then make that argument.
If the Premier League operates with free market ideology, how do you prevent this sort of problematic ownership from happening? Do fit and proper persons tests work here?
I think it's bizarre how so many people just accept the fit and proper test as a given. I don't know whether that relates to very low expectations of the Premier League and the FA, but if you look back at the owner and directors test, and there's guidelines from 2013 that talk about this, and they talk about what the object and the purpose of the owner and director test is. It says these holding positions of responsibility at clubs are required to meet obligations placed on them under the law. But then it goes on to say football believes that such persons should meet standards over and above the law so as to better protect clubs and reputation and image of the game. It's very clear what football clubs are. They're not businesses. They're subject to higher standards because they're social institutions. And the FA talks about the reputation and the image of the game. The rules themselves talk about precluding or disqualifying anyone who's engaged in dishonest conduct outside of the UK, even if a criminal conviction has not been applied. So I think there's very clear and sound reasons that could be presented to the Premier League in this case to disqualify this bid. I think it's strange that no one is pointing to those. I think it's strange that no one is pointing to the fact that the owner and directors test also prevent ownership in a case where you could have influence over another club, in this case Manchester City. So for all the talk about free markets and such, the Premier League has very clear guidelines about who can and can't own clubs. Now, whether or not those could be subject to legal challenges, I don't know. But looking at the rules and understanding that they have fairly broad discretion to interpret those rules, they could and arguably, well, I don't think arguably, I think clearly should disqualify this bid.
How much hope do you have that that will actually happen?
It's interesting, you look at the rules and the way I read them, it seems blindingly obvious that this bid should be disqualified. But I'm speaking as someone who is not in any sense intimately associated with these organisations and how they operate and the internal politics and dynamics there. The prevailing wisdom is that this bid will be ushered through without any questions asked. I would hope at the very least enough questions will be asked that will ensure if it does go through that a lot of scrutiny is placed on this ownership going forward.
Nicholas McGeehan is a human rights activist and researcher. This episode was produced by Josh Schneiderweiler and Hugo Chambray. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you enjoy this podcast, why not subscribe to our Patreon and get a raft of bonus material? Or, if you can't spare the cash, why not help us out by sharing an episode with a friend? See you next time.